Hey folks, welcome to week 7 of GID216, Motion Graphics for Interactive Media. Alright, we have a whole hodgepodge of stuff going on this week in our ongoing pursuit of checking out the 8 different areas of visual literacy as they pertain to this class. This week we are going to jump from pictograms and iconography to logos and branding marks. It's not that much of a leap from pictograms to logos. They are related, but of course they have very different purposes in life. And so we will sort of go over that today. Also this week, we are going to introduce you to a handout called Ideation Techniques. Ideation is just a sort of an industry word for brainstorming. You're very familiar with brainstorming, of course. These are just a few examples of ways in which you can brainstorm ideas, come up with some visual solutions, and go from there. So I just want to introduce you to some of them that I happen to like. You might be familiar with some of them. Maybe they'll be new to you. That's good too. We have 2 consumables this week. One is directly related to our logo and branding mark theme this week. This video here, branding and identity. This is a very quick video that goes over sort of the basics of what branding and identity is. Now you're probably familiar with this being a graphic design student. Maybe you've taken a class on this. Maybe you've done some graphics and developed some logos yourself. But for this particular class, we're treating it as an area of visual literacy because whereas pictograms and icons are visual communication tools that have their origin dating all the way back to early man, to cave drawings, branding and identity is a much more modern sort of venture. And when I say modern, I don't mean in the last 10 years, but, you know, more modern human being type venture in that branding and identity is part of a larger communication scheme that has to do with consumerism and things of that nature. So this sort of covers that a little bit. And then the other consumable this week speaks to our larger upcoming After Effects project, our project with regard to motion graphics, which is going to be the title sequence we're going to create for our newly imagined movie or TV show. Now, we're not at that project yet. We're still doing the introductory After Effects projects. You just finished Project 1, which was to create a lower third. We're just got rolling recently on Project 2, which is to create a lyric video. But soon we will be getting to our larger project, which eats up about half of the semester, which is to create a title sequence for sort of a newly imagined movie or TV show. And so the sort of originator of the idea of motion graphics and title sequences in particular is Saul Bass, who you probably have heard of maybe in our history class or in one of your design classes. And so this here is just a little overview about Saul Bass, the art of the title sequence. He really sort of invented the art form, and spoiler alert, he didn't do it alone. Saul Bass and his wife really did it together. She does not get nearly enough credit that she should for his success and for their truly collaborative effort to bring still graphic design into the world of motion. And so a lot of it has to do with the time frame in which he operated and how women were treated in the world of design, and also just sort of the way Saul Bass and his wife decided to work together. But now that we're looking back on it in hindsight, we need to understand that she should get just as much credit as he did. But anyway, this is a really good introduction to sort of his style and what it's all about. And then we'll do some more research later on in the semester, learning more about more things related to Saul Bass, his wife, and the rise of motion graphics. So those are the 3 consumables this week: the ideation techniques, which we'll look at in a second, and those 2 videos. Now we do have a week-long assignment. We are doing our second media analysis. This one is going to be on art. We'll take a look at that in a second as well. And then in the background, you're going to keep working on Project 2, which is to create your lyric video. So I told you, it's a hodgepodge this week. We got a bunch of different things intersecting this week. All right, so let's take a look at the media analysis. So let's go over to Modules and Projects. We'll go down to our Projects folder, go to the Media Analysis folder, and specifically we're going to look at Media Analysis 2, which is this one here about art. So just like Media Analysis 1, where we dove into some television shows and we answered a bunch of questions and really tried to deconstruct those television shows, we're doing the same thing with some selections of artwork. There's a bunch to choose from down below. And so it's the same structure, same setup. You have all week to work on this. You have to really analyze the piece of art of your choice and then go back and try to answer these 18 questions under different categories to the best of your ability. This all connects back to our seeing versus looking discussion we had at the very beginning of the semester, in that it's one thing to sort of just, look at something and appreciate it quickly and say, oh, that's a lovely piece of art, versus taking some time to really analyze it and see it as deeply as possible. So these question prompts are going to help you to do that, but of course you are expected to use your own analytical skills to try to really break down the artwork and give your educated opinion on it and really kind of try to break it down. So again, it's due at the end of the week. All the same rules and regulations apply as last time. Make sure you include the name of the piece of artwork, who the creator was, when it was created, if we have a year, which I actually supplied that for everybody. You can do this in a Word document, or you can make a presentation out of it if you would like. Make sure it's submitted to Blackboard by the end of the week, Friday, end of day. Check your due dates and times, okay? So I'm not going to go over all the specificity of the questions and the details, because again, it's very similar to the television one, so you should be familiar with it by now, and you can read this yourself. Now, the different media choices are as follows. Let's click through these. Let's see what we've got. I'm going to open each of these up separately. So this is your first one here. This is sometimes referred to as the Winged Victory. It is a very tall marble statue at the Louvre in Paris. I have seen it in person. It's enormous. It's strangely they had it placed on a landing on a giant stairwell. And it's funny because, of course, it's one of those classic statues that we only know it one way because that's how we have seen it. But naturally, the original had arms and a head. So we're so used to seeing it like this. And of course, if we zoom in on it, you can see that, lots of beautiful detail in the marble. So that is the first choice. Now it's referred to as the Winged Victory as sort of shorthand, but the full title is the Winged Victory of Samothrace, which I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. So that was constructed roughly in 190 BCE, okay, and the artist is completely unknown. Okay, the next one you could choose from is this here. This is the Storm on the Sea of Galilee. Let's take a look at this. And so the Storm on the Sea of Galilee is by Rembrandt, his full name Rembrandt van Rijn, from 1633. Now, at first glance, this just seems like a sailboat in the middle of a storm in the ocean, right? But if you really look closely at it and kind of zoom in and pan around, you're going to find all sorts of interesting detail about what's going on here. You might even recognize a character or two from this painting. It's a really dynamic painting. It's really beautiful. It does depict an interesting scene, and it is really loaded with metaphor. So that's that option. And that, again, is from 1633. Just like our TV shows, as we go through the list, they get newer and newer, closer in time. Now, the next one is by Johannes Vermeer, a beautiful Dutch painter. And this was painted somewhere between 1662 and 1665. This is called The Music Lesson. And we can see that here. This is a really beautiful painting done on board. You can see all sort of the cracks in the paint coming through it, but lots of interesting detail. It's an interior shot, and at first it seems fairly innocuous in that we have the music teacher standing over here and next to the student, who is a female, and you can see her reflection in the mirror, and she is working on the piano or the harpsichord. I'm not exactly sure what instrument that is, but it's a beautifully decorative harpsichord. But if you zoom in, you can see all sorts of detail going on, but really pay attention to the look on his face, the look on her face. There's some interesting inscription going on the instrument itself, as well as a variety of other items like this giant cello sitting on the ground. So that's your other option. Then we have one of my favorite paintings, The Spanish Dance by John Singer Sargent, who's an American painter. This is from 1879. This hangs in the Elizabeth Stuart Gardner Museum in Boston, so you can actually go see this one in person. It is really huge. It's much bigger in person than you would think it is. It's probably a good like 12, 15 feet tall, but it's a great painting. I really love this one, but there's a lot going on. Again, like all of our choices here, there's more things happening in the artwork than you can probably take in at first glance. So again, seeing versus looking. Look at all the characters in the background watching this woman dance. What's going on with all of them? So again, zoom in and look around and really pay attention to all the details when you're trying to answer those questions. Okay, next we have another one of my favorite paintings. This is a bar at Folies Bergère, which is an actual bar in France. This was painted by Edouard Manet in 1882. Manet, not to be confused with Monet. Monet is probably, arguably, of the two of them, the more famous Impressionist painter. Manet, however, is also a wonderful Impressionist painter. And you might be familiar with this one. This one's pretty popular. But very interesting detail going on here. Similar to the music lesson, there is a mirror in the background and some reflection activity going on. The sort of structure of the reflection is a little strange in terms of how we see the back of the barmaiden compared to the patron. Now, this says something about who the patron is based on the way this painting is constructed. So think about that. And because it's an impressionistic painting, of course, the brush strokes are very large and textural, so you can really get in there and look at the detail quite a bit. Okay, so that's the other option. Then we have this famous sketch, I'll call it, from 1955 by Pablo Picasso. This is of Don Quixote, and you're probably familiar with the story of Don Quixote. This is done in sort of ink, and it's Don Quixote with his assistant, who's riding with him. Don Quixote is on a horse. His assistant is on a donkey. And maybe you're familiar with the story of The Man of La Mancha, which is a famous musical, or you've read the story of Don Quixote. But anyway, it's a beautiful story. But this is a sketch of the two of the main characters by Pablo Picasso, done in a style that Picasso is not really known for. One thing about Picasso is that he could employ a variety of artistic styles in his work. He's most known for his deconstructed abstract work, but of course he drew very realistically, he could paint realistically, he could sketch, he could draw. The guy was versatile. And so this is an example of a style of art that maybe you're not used to seeing with the name Pablo Picasso attached to it. Okay, the next one is called Artistic Space Number 44 by a photographer, Cindy Sherman. This is from 1960. Cindy Sherman is a really interesting photographer in that she not only tells sort of interesting narrative stories with her photography, but the majority of the time she is the subject of the photograph. So these are staged photographs where she is sort of setting up a scene, she's setting up characters, she's setting up props. The camera is on a tripod. She uses sequencing and timers to take the photographs, and she herself is the subject in a lot of her photographs. So these are almost self-portraits, but she's not playing herself. She's playing characters in these. And so this is her. This is the photographer as the character in the story. There's a lot of storytelling going on in this photograph. What happened with the bag of groceries? Why does she have that look on her face? What do her clothes have to do with the story going on? So a lot to sort of untangle here in this photograph. Okay, next we have a graphic from Roy Lichtenstein from 1963 called Drowning Girl. Now, Roy Lichtenstein is a famous pop artist. Like Andy Warhol, they functioned mostly around the 1960s. Pop artists took the visual vocabulary of very common commercial art forms and turned them into fine art. I'm way oversimplifying what pop art is, but you get the idea. And so as you can probably tell by looking at this piece, that Roy Lichtenstein took the visual vocabulary of comic books and used it for his fine art. And when I say visual vocabulary, I'm talking about things like the thought balloon, the black line style in which the characters are drawn, and the use of duotone, which is this sort of dot pattern, which is used for coloring purposes as well as sort of ink washes and whatnot for some of the other coloring. So Roy Lichtenstein really leveraged that sort of comic book visual for his fine art. The point of pop art was that you would use a style that people were familiar with for perhaps non-artistic output, and then make it more easily accessible that way. Andy Warhol used silk screening, and he would use common elements like, of course, his famous Campbell's soup can, but of course he's known for much more than that. But you get the idea. So this is Roy Lichtenstein's piece. And then last but not least, we have a slightly more modern artist from 2007, Shepard Fairey. He is a collage artist, and this is called Afrocentric Power and Equality. Now, as a collage artist, of course, collages, as you know, are pieces of art that are made up of other pieces of things, whether it be other art or other things in general. And so Shepard Fairey does everything from using pieces of wallpaper to silk screening to literally ripping up pieces of paper and gluing them together. And so this is his piece, Afrocentric Power and Equality. And you can see that like the texture that is used in the graphic for this woman's hair is actually wallpaper. It is actually sort of textured wallpaper. And then you can see pieces of newspaper in the background, as well as silk screening, and a whole bunch of other techniques sort of merged together. Now, Shepard Fairey is an interesting artist in that he's a real sort of almost, and I'm going to use the term graffiti, but not in the way you might imagine it, but sort of almost a street level artist using graffiti techniques and collage techniques in a way that really kind of is very evocative and done sort of with a lot of energy behind it. But at the same time, because he's a collage artist, he pulls things from other places, some of which he's gotten into a little bit of trouble with because he's been accused of copyright infringement because some of the things he puts into his work belong to other people. That being said, he still is a really interesting artist who does some amazing stuff, and his work is definitely worth zooming in on because there are all sorts of hidden textures and whatnot, which I will say none of them are there by accident. Okay, so the media analysis for the week is to choose one of those pieces of art, whichever one you find most interesting, to do a little bit of background research on each one and spend a lot of time basically staring at it and really trying to document as many of the details as possible. Once you've got that done, go back and try to answer these 18 questions to the best of your ability based on your observations and research, okay? All right, so that's the main thing for this week. Let's go back to home and down to our week 6 module again. Okay. Oh, wait. Week 7. What am I talking about? Week 6. Holy cow. Okay. So let's look at our week 7 module. That's better. Okay. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is the idea of logos and branding marks. So let's take a look at some of our options here and what we're going to see. Now, of course, you are familiar with sort of logos and branding marks because they eventually end up into sort of branding identity systems. So whether it be sort of a stationary system, you know, everything from letterhead to envelopes to business cards to other deliverables like mugs and buttons and whatnot, you know, you take the idea of a logo and you sort of explode it outwards and use the various component parts, the typography, the shapes, the color palettes, and you apply that across a variety of deliverables. Now, this is sort of a traditional print set of items, and here's another one. These are just samples. You can see that they don't really, these are not real for real companies, but you get the idea. But of course, they can be applied even more whimsically. Now, again, these are print deliverables for this particular logo brand, and this is obviously a little more upbeat and fun. And again, printed things like stationery, but also things like folders and advertisement and buttons and all sorts of things. This is a sort of recent rebrand design from Mount Sinai Hospital. They not only redesigned their logo, which you can see here, but then they put a lot of work into how to deconstruct that and reapply it to a variety of deliverables. Now, the ones we just sort of looked through quickly, those are sort of traditional print ones, and they do have some print items here, like folders and bags and whatnot. But they also have mobile applications, as seen here on this tablet, and their website, as well as their mobile website, the responsive site for their their website as seen here on a mobile phone. So the idea of a logo isn't just let's create an interesting logo that's easy to sort of recognize and understand, but we need to have a visual vocabulary that we can deconstruct and apply to a variety of different places. And it starts out with the logo design. It starts out with that simple graphic and typographic treatment that has a lot in common with the pictograms that we looked at before, but really must tell a much larger story. Now, we talked about, in the first week, we looked at sort of the idea of deconstructing an apple down to a really simple black and white pictogram of an apple, but then we looked at the Apple logo in black and white and said that while that visually is very similar to a pictogram, it tells a much bigger story because it's about the brand of Apple Computer. Same thing here. This graphic that they came up with for Mount Sinai, sure, it speaks to the name, Mount, as in mountain, Sinai, and it's a really simple graphic. It shows interconnectivity. It has a nice color palette and all that. But unto itself, you might say, well, that's an interesting pictogram or an interesting graphic. But it tells a much larger story because of what Mount Sinai is. If you're familiar with the hospital and all the services that it offers and all the specialties, as well as its reputation and its history, the story that this logo tells gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And that says nothing of the fact that it has to be applied to all these deliverables and many more. I'm sure if you visit the hospital, you'll see variations on this logo and identity system in all of the signage and wayfinding systems. So it's everywhere. This here is an example of sort of a identity system style guide where we have the logo design here, which employs a graphic, some nice typography, but then we get into sort of the settled upon color palette with all the coding information about how to create those colors, whether it be CMYK or RGB. We have the primary typefaces, the font choices, and the different ways in which they can be used. Some examples of how to use the logo or how not to use the logo, or how the typeface is employed. An example of it applied to different deliverables, both in print and digital environments. Some close-ups of some of those deliverables, and so on and so forth, as well as a 3D version of the logo. So the application of logos really goes way beyond it just being a simple pictogram or graphic and really starts to tell a much larger story. But, like I said, they are related to pictograms and graphics, and so as a result, you want to start out with various iterations. So this here is 3 sheets showing somebody's thumbnail sketches for a logo idea that is based on a bumblebee, right? And so if somebody said to you, design me a logo based on a bumblebee, you would want to go through a variety of different deconstructive iterations of what you imagine as a bumblebee. And so here on page 1, you can see they started out with some simple pencil sketches, sort of little graphical or cartoon versions of bumblebees, and then introducing some color using some simple shapes and lines and smudges and whatnot. And then getting into some more abstract representations of bumblebees, like these that are just made up of lines. Something a little more whimsical, where the wings become a heart. Then getting into the letter B, because it's a bumblebee, and using some of those. Even more abstract representations. Now you're doing sort of like visual word association, where you're bringing in elements that are related to bumblebees, such as kind of this blob of honey, this hexagram shape, which of course is part of the honeycomb shape that we see in hives. These sort of stripes that imply motion but use the bee colors, more honeycombs, etc., etc. A variety of different sort of options. Now, when you're thumbnailing, and you've probably had to do this for other projects, the idea is to wring out as many visual ideas out of your head as you possibly can in a very short amount of time. These are done quickly using simple tools, markers, pens, pencils, that's it. You can do a little bit of digital too, but usually analog art tools are best. This doesn't mean that they're all great ideas. You're just trying to get out all the ideas, right? And really do some deconstruction of the visual. So, these happy face ideas maybe are not the best ideas, but they're getting them out. Here we've got some more using some pen and ink. Everything from drops of honey to various abstract shapes, playing around with cross-hatching, the shape of the bees, and so on and so forth. The path in which bees fly. Bees don't normally fly in a straight line, so they're sort of playing around with that concept. And then the last page, they started introducing some digital ideas, although you can see they go back to some pen in a second. the double bees, a couple of different bees, more graphical interpretations of bees, a three-dimensional bee, and so on and so on and so on. Somewhere in this 3 pages of sort of deconstructing the concept of a bumblebee into a graphic of a bumblebee, you've got some good ideas that you can run with. And if I told you to pick out your 2 or 3 favorites from these and then go develop them further, you could do that. So the idea of sort of a piece of visual literacy related to kind of logo design, it's important to understand that because as humans we can read pictures, particularly pictograms and icons, very quickly, logos have a lot of power built into them because of the fact that humans can automatically recognize simple forms and shapes, which make a really good basis for logos. Then once you've determined what that is, you can develop it further into a system, something like this, and then expand it out further. Now, again, this is not a branding and identity class, but I did want to point out that this is sort of the next logical step from pictograms as a communication device to logos as a branding foundational tool. So that's sort of where we are with that. Okay, so again, watch the branding and identity video. That'll help further that out a little bit, just to sort of keep it in mind. I will say that of the 8 visual literacy tenets that we're looking at in this class, this one is really meant to sort of piggyback more on the idea of pictograms and not really be its own thing. But I just wanted to sort of bring it up because I know you're aware of it as an area of design. Okay, so that is it for this week. Remember, make sure you consume all of these things here, the videos and whatnot. Oh, I forgot to show you the ideation techniques. Let's take a look here, over to here. Okay, so this handout here goes over some ideation techniques that I happen to like. Now, of course, everybody has their own. There's a ton of good ones. But you can read through this one and play around with some ideas. We have one-a-days, mind maps, the dump and clump technique, the soak, wash, rinse, and spin technique, thumbnail iterations, which we were just looking at examples of those with the bumblebees, and abstraction. These are all sort of techniques that help you sort of get visual ideas out of your head and onto paper or onto a screen. Allows you to sort of brainstorm. One-a-days, as you probably know, is the idea of taking a simple theme or prompt and doing it every single day for a period of time. So it could be for a week, could be for a month, could be for a whole year. This is done a lot in photography, but also in drawing, as well as other areas of art and design. So one-a-days are a good way to sort of just keep doing the same thing over and over again in very small amounts until you get some really interesting results. Mind maps you might be familiar with. Here's an example of some mind maps, which mind maps are just basically visual word association. So it helps to do this with a team of people. You write down your basic idea and then you make a connection to it and you write down the first word or draw a picture of whatever comes to mind immediately. And then you branch out from there. And before you know it, you have a whole board or wall full of ideas. This one's more about drawing and some basic words. This one's done digitally using a tool called Coggle. But either way, mind mapping is a good way to sort of dump out all the ideas that spring to your brain immediately. Speaking of dumping, dump and clump is a really interesting technique using Post-it notes. It allows you to try to answer some basic questions, jot down your ideas really fast, and then group together your Post-it notes by related concepts. So that's something to sort of play around with too. Perhaps you're familiar with that. Soak, wash, rinse, and spin is a little more of a complex way of working, but I broke it down into these sort of basic areas here. Research, which is to intake as much information as you can. Collaboration, to collaborate with either team members or clients or other people invested in it. To do visual exploration, which includes using workbooks and refining your ideas, examining multiple options, and then looking at environmental influences, sort of the consideration of the ultimate purpose of the solution. This is based on a book of the same name. It's actually a really interesting technique. Then thumbnail iterations. We just looked at some thumbnails of bumblebees, but as you're probably familiar with, thumbnails are really a good way to get down quick ideas fast. They're not all supposed to be wonderful. In fact, you might not even understand half of them, but it's just to get the ideas out. And then, of course, once you've got your thumbnails, you can do some abstraction. Take something that's common, like in this case, a graphic of a compass, and break it down into simpler and simpler forms until you get something new. So that's abstraction. So anyway, these are just ideation techniques that you can play around with. Perhaps you have your own brainstorming techniques that you like to use. I always have students say they listen to music, they go for a walk, they ride their bike, they do a bunch of different things. So whatever works for you to sort of help you come up with good ideas. Now, this handout I use in a few different classes. It's not really specific just to this class. But seeing as we're getting into some more complex projects here, I think it's a good idea to really make sure that you have a system for brainstorming that sort of works for you. Okay, these examples here I forgot to show you when we were looking at logo ideas and design. We were talking about abstraction and pictograms. This is a set of 50 abstractions and pictograms that were used for logo exploration for a client that I had a bunch of years ago. It's a building cleaning company, you know, the people that go into buildings with those big jumpsuits to do sort of heavy-duty cleaning. I was hired to design a logo and do a branding system for them, and sort of did a whole bunch of simple black and white abstractions of pretty much cleaning tools, cleaning concepts, etc. And I just sort of wanted to scroll through this to show you that you can really, beyond thumbnails, really wring out ideas even further in this very stark sort of black and white context. Then I start to add some grays and some typography as we go along here to really kind of combine ideas and play with it. A lot of negative and positive space, everything from graphical representations to more cartoony representations, completely abstract geometric representations, and so on and so forth. So our ability as humans to really recognize simple shapes and symbols goes a long way in sort of you being able to try out a variety of different, logo ideas if you're doing this sort of thing. Anyway, just something to be familiar with and to pay attention to in terms of our ability to visually understand sort of graphics and clues and logos and whatnot. Okay, so that is it for today. Think about those things. Be sure to watch these videos. And of course, most importantly, do your media analysis for the various art choices. And in the background, keep working on Project 2, which is our lyric video. If you have any questions, thoughts, concerns, need any help, be sure to grab me on the weekly office hours, Mondays and Fridays, 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. Be sure to drop in. Would love to see you. All right, good luck and happy working.